Today, how Trump's decision to defund US propaganda operations is about to change the world. The secret of a top CIA man's doodle. The story of how Western groups are now echoing a warning given by the Chinese years ago. And what Henry Kissinger revealed to Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai about the CIA. But first, facts, figures, evidence, sources. It's been widely reported that several US propaganda arms have been defunded, from Radio Free Asia to Voice of America to the NED, or National Endowment for Democracy. Now that's true enough, but there's a much bigger story here. The NED by itself funds about 2,000 separate organizations a year around the planet, according to its own records. And if the NED's cash pipeline has been cut, that means that they will also lose their money. And that's huge news in itself. We're talking about a huge network of tens of thousands of people across the world who are no longer being paid to demonize the rivals or competitors of the United States. Now, of these, we know there are scores of groups paid to create a negative view of China. We also know that there are more than 50 US-funded groups just attacking tiny Cuba. And there are literally hundreds of groups cultivating hostility towards other nations that the US State Department has been targeting, including Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They're set to run out of funds. But where's the list of these 2,000 groups? The NED from day one has always said it is entirely transparent about who it funds. So we should be able to look up the names, right? Wrong. In recent times, they've become very vague about who they were financing. Details of Hong Kong cash recipients disappeared many years ago. Then Ukraine recipients disappeared in 2022. And now the details of pretty much all recipients have all disappeared. The only data left tells us what sort of processors they are funding in each country. And it's exactly the same types of groups the CIA used to fund directly, such as anti-China media, anti-government activist groups, so-called human rights groups, and even the same sort of free Tibet groups that the CIA notoriously set up in the 1960s. So the NED's claim to be transparent, it's clearly not true. Also at the moment there's a disclaimer saying that this is the situation up to the date of January 15th, 2025. What about after that? Now, the leaks that reveal that the cash pipeline was taken away from the NED emerged from a group called the FP on the 11th of February. That's about 4 weeks later. So things are clearly up in the air right now for the NED and its thousands of funded offspring. Let's consider another claim. The NED claims to be non-governmental, but several independent journalists have accessed their financial records. Here they are. And they show two interesting things. First, they're about 99% financed by the US authorities, 99%. So the claim of independence is, well, rather weak, shall we say. Second, the NED and its propaganda units are so rich. In recent years, they've received as much as $360 million US dollars in a 12-month period. That's almost $1 million a day to finance people like Luke DePulford to do what he likes to do, which is to pressure other countries to take a hard line on China. So there we have it, the richest countries in the world cultivating hate for a developing country that is rising through its own hard work. Charming, Luke, just charming. But there's some even bigger news in the pipeline. There are now multiple US sources who are admitting that the National Endowment for Democracy is not about democracy, which is what the Chinese have been saying for years, not to mention yours truly. And not just the Chinese, many diplomats have long joked that the NED really stands for National Enemy of Democracy. In 2019, the Chinese said that the NED was a network focused on creating disinformation that will be used for color revolutions. Now here's what the Heritage Foundation, a major American information group, says about the NED today. The NED's programming supported the international disinformation industrial complex, which originated in methodologies developed by the NED and others to support color revolutions overseas. Yep, so get that? Disinformation industrial complex, color revolutions. The Heritage Foundation people are saying exactly what the Chinese have been saying for years. But there's more. Independent journalists in Asia have also been saying for years that the NED pushes its own brand of US foreign policy under the guise of promoting democracy. Now here's what we read in the New Criterion, which is a rather grand US literary journal based in New York. In truth, the NED has been running its own renegade foreign policy under the guise of promoting democracy. Yes, exactly as we said. Now, when we said that, people said, oh, you're lying, pro-China. But now Western groups are saying it. Another example, the NED has, since its inception, been more of a tool for US political interests than an inoffensive vehicle for democracy promotion, wrote Branko Marcetic in Jacobin, a US political journal from New York. And intelligence historian William Blum wrote, the creation of the NED was a masterpiece of politics, of public relations, and of cynicism. Now, the NED people may argue that, well, this is just some people's opinion. Where's the hard evidence? We have it. To answer that question, we turn to academia. There are lots of studies about covert operations by the US, including studies with plenty of data and analysis. Let me just highlight the work of Lindsay O'Rourke of Boston University, who shows very clearly, with detailed research and citations, how the regime change operations of the United States, from the CIA to the NED to associated agencies, are not interested in putting democratic leaders in power, but in advancing the interests of the United States. Now, these studies also show that the operations tended to fail, and even when they did succeed in putting a US allied leader in power, there were very few long-term advantages. In short, manipulating foreign elections was just not a good way for the US to make friends overseas, and usually led to general unhappiness and instability. I can think of several examples myself. The US man in South Korea is in a horrible mess right now behind bars. Taiwan's leader is widely hated, and deservedly so. And the Philippines, well, let's just say that President Marcos does not get a lot of respect inside or outside his country, and with very good reason. Another thing the study shows is that US regime change operations are more likely to put authoritarian leaders into power than democratic ones. Yeah. Now, NED staff people and supporters always respond to accusations like this by saying that, well, the NED is not a CIA front. They're not officially related. I'm glad you said that, because I have some evidence that may change your mind. Let me tell you an amazing story. By the early 1980s, the CIA had a terrible reputation for extreme and often illegal meddling around the world, including assassinations. But then an idea emerged in the US about what should be done. The suggestion was made in a letter that the US create, quote, a national endowment in support of free institutions throughout the world. Here's the original letter, written to a White House official by a man called William Casey. Who was he? He was the director of the CIA. Now, Casey is the man who famously said, we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false. Now, some sources say there's not much proof that he actually said that, but the person who provided the quote, Barbara Honegger, is very specific. She was a policy researcher who said she heard him say it with her own ears at a meeting in the White House Roosevelt Room in February 1981. And it makes sense. The CIA certainly had a well-deserved reputation for creating fake narratives and fooling everyone, both foreigners and US citizens. Now, when the NED was officially created in 1983, Congress inserted a clause saying that it must be separate from the CIA. But the director of the CIA, William Casey, had that section removed at the last minute. He also departed from the idea of separation by placing a former CIA man named Walter Raymond Jr. at the top of it. Raymond saw himself as a CIA puppet master pulling the strings. How do we know that? Because he drew a diagram showing the network with him at the top. Here it is. Now, the NED, unsurprisingly, soon showed itself to be not that different to the CIA. In the 1980s, the NED was the public face of Oliver North's Project Democracy, in which an agent ran drug smuggling and arms distribution operations, got involved in a war. In the 1990s, the NED helped overthrow democratically elected governments in Bulgaria and in Albania. And in the 2000s, it poured millions into Hong Kong and Taiwan to cultivate hostility against mainland China. Why on earth would anyone want to go to this lovely, peaceful, hard-working place, Hong Kong, and stir up polarization and violence? It absolutely amazes me. In 2020, NED was a founding sponsor of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, a UK-based organisation that works full-time cultivating anti-Chinese attitudes in countries around the world. The world desperately needs bridges, and Dipolford works hard at building walls. Now, as mentioned, the NED has financed more than 50 anti-government groups in Cuba. Now, Cuban journalist Paul Antonio Capote wrote recently about the NED. Its eventual bankruptcy, if it comes, will only hurt subversives and terrorists who live off its funds. The peoples and sovereign governments, on the other hand, will breathe a sigh of relief. Too right. How does the NED system actually work? Well, the group sponsors these thousands of organisations here, and they create narratives which they legitimise by quoting each other. Case study. In 2018, the CIA-led Five Eyes group of intelligence agencies invented stories that China was genociding the Chinese Uyghur ethnic group in Xinjiang, despite the fact that this was not true, and many political leaders, police officers and local authorities in that area were actually Uyghurs themselves. Now, the bad guys took this 2017 image of people at a drug rehabilitation centre listening to a Muslim speaker and gave it to the Western media, relabelled as a Chinese concentration camp for Uyghurs. By 2019, the Western media was running numerous reports from a group called the World Uyghur Congress about China's death camps in Xinjiang, without mentioning that the group was set up and financed by the NED. Then they printed evidence for the millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps narrative from a group called the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Again, without mentioning the group was set up by the NED, it's financed by the NED. To further reinforce the story, a large number of interviews and personal stories were pushed by the BBC and other media from apparently mistreated Uyghur individuals, supplied by a group called the Campaign for Uyghurs, an organisation financed by, you guessed it, the NED. And there's more, there's a database of human rights violations called the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database with statistics about victims. The funding, unmentioned in news reports, was, yes, the NED. What about the truth? I mean, it's clear now that there never were millions of Uyghurs in this jail. The largest prisons in the world are built for only about 10,000 prisoners. Nor has there been a genocide. The Uyghur population has actually been growing faster than other ethnicities in China. Now, to this day, virtually all Western mainstream media outlets quote groups like these while omitting their Washington, D.C. financing. Now, as the Cuban journalist quoted earlier said, the financial problems of the NED and its thousands of offspring is actually good news for everyone who believes in the sovereign rights of communities. But academic research on the topic shows that this may be good news for Americans too. Not only are covert regime change or political influence operations expensive, but they fail more often than they succeed. The failures in Beijing in 1989 and Hong Kong in 2019 are not unusual by any means. Henry Kissinger in particular was scathing about the failures of the CIA and other associated operations. In 1971, Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai famously raised the issue with Kissinger, asking him about why US groups were covertly interfering, stirring up trouble with politics in multiple places. Kissinger replied that the Chinese criticism vastly overestimates the competence of the CIA. Zhou replied, whenever something happens in the world, they are always thought of. Kissinger nodded. Yeah, that's true. And it flatters them, but they don't deserve it. He's right. Academic studies certainly show that covert political interference operations are everywhere, but they rarely produce positive outcomes and generally just create problems for all sides. That's certainly been true in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. The end of the NED would be good news for East and West. But let's not celebrate too early. The NED offices are still in place, as are their networks around the world. Yet smart countries, smart cities, smart communities won't let NED people meddle. And they've made it clear that their devious brand of political interference is not wanted. NED groups were ousted from Iran in 2010, restricted in India in 2016, and they've been made unwelcome as trouble causers in Egypt, Venezuela, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. Wherever you are watching this video from, make sure your government protects your sovereignty from people like this. Peace.